Mummy, is this where the leopard hospital was? It's leper hospital, darling. Don't take your seatbelt off until we've parked. What's a leper, Mummy? Daddy, hurry up and park. I'm trying to, love. Won't be long now. It's an ill person, darling. Bits of them fall off. Ugh. Dunning smiled to himself at the conversation as he guided the car slowly along the increasingly narrow country lanes. Trees stooped down from the grassy banks as though checking his speed. A tight turn made him slow even further, but then he saw the signpost and knew they were almost at the beach. Is that true? He asked his wife as they picked up speed again on a straight lane that should lead them to a car park. There really was a leper hospital right here. Kate had a knowing smile on her face. Her green eyes caught the sunlight like prisms. Not anymore before you ask if we can go visit, but yes, there was. A very long time ago now. The lane narrowed again, and up ahead a troop of walkers were marching towards him like they had nothing to fear. I think here's a bunch now. Mummy, are they lepers? Did their bits fall off? No, Charlotte, your father's being silly again. Best not to believe anything he says. Don't listen to her, Charlotte. At least not about not listening to me. Where would we be then? A couple of metres from the car, the walkers grudgingly formed a single file line along the side of the lane. Come on, Dunning muttered. If you don't clear the way, I'll make some bloody bits fall off you. Daddy, you did a swear. Well, your mother told you not to listen to me, didn't she? The car park was a large expanse of uneven waste ground leading to the dunes on one side and a long wooden shack that promised teas, ices, refreshments on the other. He navigated the rough ground carefully, though they were still thoroughly shaken about by the time he found a decent spot to leave the car. Kate walked alongside him, slipped a hand into the rear pocket of his jeans, casting him a look that was the right kind of dirty over the top of her sunglasses. Charlotte lost interest, as she always did whenever she sensed anything that might lead to boring, grown-up, yucky kissing, and ran off towards the beach. Enjoying yourself? Dunning asked his wife as they followed her at a lingering pace. On the benches outside the refreshment shack, middle-aged people were resting their cumbersome stomachs on their knees. A delightful time, Kate replied. Thank you. Has much of it changed since you were a girl? A lot of things look different, but still rather familiar. I guess your memories fade over the years or change completely. You convince yourself that something was one way, and when you go back to check, it really wasn't. Does that make sense? Dunning saw the sea as they reached the cliff-top path. It seemed like a reflection of the sky above that had turned angry and was trying to drag itself along the beach with claws of foamy waves. Children and dogs ran splashing through it, whilst their respective parents and owners lay like driftwood on the pebbles. Sure, he told her, as they trudged down the steps to where Charlotte waited, waving on the beach. Memories are not definite. They're hardly a perfect record. They're too sensitive, too subject to influence by so many other things. They reached the bottom of the steps and smiled down at his daughter. I guess bits drop off them too. Yuck, you're talking about leopards again. Charlotte screwed up her face. Dunning realised that whenever she did so, she looked exactly how he remembered Kate's mother in her old age, wrapped in a tartan rug by the fireplace, and her face twisted into a permanent grimace of distaste, usually at him. Mummy, will you race me along the beach? Let's ask your father if he wants to join us first. He won't. Daddy's too slow. Well, how about it? Kate asked him. Fancy working up a sweat? I'll save myself for later, thanks. Besides, I'm too slow. He smiled as they ran away together along the beach, beneath the overhanging cliffs where once a whole city had stood. Over the years, the sea had claimed it for its own, and whatever remained of it now was deep beneath the waves. The very idea had fascinated him ever since Kate told him the story and the legends and myths which had quite naturally grown around it. Kate had grown up 30 miles along the coast. until her parents separated when she'd been 13, and her mother had taken her to live in the Midlands. This holiday, some 30 years later, was the first time she'd returned. His previous experience of the English seaside was pretty much limited to awful bank holiday excursions to Blackpool with his parents as a boy. He first started to suspect the mysteries of adulthood when, at age 6, he'd found a condom in the sand he was using to build a castle. It felt strange to remember that now, after all these years, and almost unsettling that he had nobody to share the memory with. Along the coast, his wife and child were miniature versions of themselves, as though his family were being rendered much less significant. He tried to march quickly towards them and outpace the morbid notion. He was glad when they were near enough for him to reach out to, and then to hold on to. "It's hard running on beaches," Charlotte informed him. "It's like being on the moon." The three of them walked together to where the waves were darkening the sand, stepping forwards and backwards in a laughing line to dare the water. Dunning himself was the first to get splashed, and he dragged the other two with him. They spent the rest of the afternoon trudging back along the beach and then along the cliff tops until Dunning felt as though they were looking for something not easily apparent at first glance. They found a good site to sit and rest, and Kate told him about the nearby Abbey ruins, now little more than a jagged wall, but once a mighty and magnificent building which had sat some miles in from the coast. He shook his head as he gazed towards a point where the land fell away to the sea, a solitary tombstone like a bad tooth, all that remained of a large graveyard. He thought about the land being pulled apart by the sea, a notion haunting enough by itself. There was no need for him to think of the bodies disturbed as they were torn from the ground where they'd been laid to rest. Charlotte was running around the ruins. He would catch the occasional glimpse of her flitting by like a ghost. The breeze stirred and brushed by him. The sky above the sea darkened a shade, and where the two met, clouds were gathering. "Looks like we're in for a summer shower," Kate told him, reaching forward to grab his hand as if he were the only protection she could ever need. "Let's go and get some lunch, and then we can get this one home to bed." He stood up with a smile, feeling genuinely good. Any haunting, morbid thoughts that may have been stirred in his mind had no place there on such a beautiful day. He was a lucky man. Kate called Charlotte out of hiding, and as they were waiting for her to run across from the ruins, she told him another story. "There were quite a number of churches here in the past." "Really? Is that big a place?" "Yes. There's a story that you'll enjoy, and I don't know how likely this is, but sometimes when it's quiet, you can hear the church bells ringing from beneath the sea." Though the idea intrigued him, Dunning couldn't help but shudder. Charlotte bounded up to them, and he gathered his family in his arms and started to stroll back along the cliff tops towards the car. The storm gathering over the sea was sending darker waves towards the shore. He wondered what they might be stirring up. "What did you think, Charlotte? Isn't this place great?" "I liked the broken church and I liked the beach, but I saw a funny man." "Funnier than me? Where was he then?" "Behind the broken church. I think he'd come up from the sea." Kate laughed affectionately. "You mean he came up from the beach?" "He came up from the beach and then he went into the trees." "I hope you didn't follow him," Dunning warned good-naturedly. "Men who go into trees stop being men and often turn back into monkeys." "He was wearing a white blanket. I could only see his hands sticking out and a bit of his face. He didn't look very well." "Well, perhaps he'd been bathing in the sea, dear, and he'd had enough for now," Kate answered. "Perhaps he got sunstroke, like when you fell asleep in the garden last summer and we thought you'd been boiled." They reached the car park and he unlocked the doors to usher them in. Charlotte was frowning, and before he shut her into the back of the car, he heard her murmur, "He didn't have much of a suntan. He was as white as snow." A light rain followed them several miles inland, where they found a large country inn. Inside, everything was warmth and good cheer. They found one of the few unoccupied corners of the oak-beamed dining room, and as Dunning queued at the bar to place her order, he was watched over by a stag's head above a fireplace. 2 hours later, stuffed with fine food and drink, they started back towards a holiday cottage. The rain had stopped, and the sun returned for the last part of the day. As they drove along the coast road, smooth jazz playing softly, they saw the sunlight scattered across the silver sea like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Charlotte was now on the verge of falling asleep, and Kate was leaning against his shoulder, drunk from the wine she'd had and smiling contentedly. Back at the cottage, he saw them both to bed, Charlotte first, sleepily murmuring the bundle in his arms. He lowered her into bed and checked she was comfortable before leading her to find the perfect end to her day in dreams. Dunning found Kate in the main bedroom, silhouetted against the soft early evening light through the window. He pushed the bedroom door shut behind him, and Kate pulled him towards her. He held her close. The heat from her body made him want her so badly, made him feel so alive. They fell onto the bed and filled their senses of each other, a lovemaking so hungry that it was as though they were both afraid it would be the last time, and feeling so close that they may as well have blurred into one another until a ferocious orgasm shattered them both into a million electric pieces. They lay holding each other as the summer darkened. "I love you," Dunning said, and more than words he meant it with his heart and soul and every fibre of his being. "I love you too," Kate replied, her eyes luminous in the dimming shadows. "So deeply. We have a wonderful life." "We certainly do. You look tired." "A little. I think I'll have a rest for a while and then I can make us some dinner." "Don't worry yourself. If you're tired, you get some sleep and I'll fix myself something to eat later. I thought about going for a drive, soak up some moonlight and some of this wonderful peace and quiet." Kate had her eyes half closed now and was murmuring sleepily, "Okay, be safe. I've had such a lovely day." "Me too. I love you. I love you. See you in the morning. Bye." The evening was beautiful. Dunning drove with a window down and a breeze billowing his linen shirt. The carriageway was almost empty, a wide open stretch of road beneath a beautiful sky of velvet purples and vivid pinks. He knew where he was heading. The remnants of a coastal town had been haunting him ever since that morning. He'd wondered what it would be like without the dogs, the children, the tourists, even the sunlight. He'd thought of standing on the cliffs bathed in silvery moonlight, thick as paint, and hearing the sound of drowned church bells from beneath a sea that covered so many secrets. In the twilight, the forests beyond the heath had solidified into one dark mass. Something cried out, a lonely sound that touched his heart, and beyond all that, he could hear the secretive whispering of the sea. He pulled into the car park and switched off the engine, and then the lights. The night fell in upon the car, and he felt a much smaller part of the world than he had previously. He could hear the waves crashing, whispering beyond the car park, beyond the cliffs. There was a beautiful full moon, like a disk of perfect white innocence in a sky the colour of velvet sin. At his back, the heath and trees beyond it seemed alive with whisperings of their own. As his eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness, Dunning marched across the car park. He reached the cliff top and looked down over the moonlit beach, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the bone-white figure staring back at him. He stepped back from the edge of the cliff, both startled and embarrassed, even when his mind had settled enough to tell him that only driftwood could look so stripped and incomplete. He was loath to venture back. Instead, he set off walking along the cliff top, ground which had once been a couple of miles inland, a thought that served him to remind him of all that lay beneath the cold and whispering sea. Trees creaked in a sudden wind. The long grass rustled as if something had broken out of hiding towards him. Of course, there was nothing that he could see, only now that his eyes had adjusted to the night, he could see thin, twisted, pale figures amongst the trees. Silver birches, no doubt, but the illusion was an unpleasant one. He smiled to himself, and then something deep in the woods cried out, and one of the pale figures moved out of sight amongst the trees. Dunning paused, but it seemed darker over there than before. Could he really be certain that something had moved, rather than a trick of perspective as he walked, making it appear to? And even if so, what of it? Had anyone else less right to be out here than he had? He set off walking again, but his nerves were taut, and he promised himself that he would go only as far as the Abbey ruins before heading back. Though the night had music of its own, Dunning himself felt so soundless as to be a ghost. He wanted to make some noise as if to prove his own substance, but he felt foolish thinking about it, and even a little wary of attracting the attention of anything that might be sharing the darkness with him. When he heard the cliff clattering beneath his feet, he knew he must have dislodged some loose rock, but his mind was full of the image of an incomplete figure as pale as drowned flesh clambering up from the beach towards him. Here were the ruins just ahead. If he'd been any less foolish, he could have enjoyed the walk as much as he'd expected to. He had to smile at least, imagining how amused Kate would be in the morning as he recounted his misadventures, as she pictured him blundering around white as a sheet and jumping at his own shadow. He picked his way across the grass to make a circuit of a ruin. The churchyard's last remaining gravestone seemed a good enough warning to venture no further. In the clear moonlight, the ruins were crisply outlined in silver, an ethereal and dreamlike image. As he watched, something darted from the trees and out of sight behind the ruins. It was a dog. It had to be so thin that its rib cage was visible and to move on all fours like that. But Dunning was uneasy and far from reassured. He could have sworn that the creature had dropped onto all fours from a standing position. Whatever he'd seen, it was time to go, and he had to admit that he would be safer taking the long way round through the trees than walking along the cliff top in plain sight. His heart was hammering his chest like a fist, and blood roared in his ears as though bringing the sea into him. He kept glancing warily at the ruins as he approached the cover of the trees. He really wasn't far from his car. He must remember that. He would soon be safe and heading back to his family, and probably, if he could find sleep, the best nightmare he'd ever had. Stepping into the woods felt like letting the dark claim him. Some nocturnal creature wailed, and he wished he knew enough to tell himself what it was. Things were moving about deeper amongst the trees, but That needn't worry him, as their steps sounded much lighter than a human's would be. He hadn't realised how bright the moonlight had been back out in the open until he'd stepped out of it. The trees nearest to him were merely sketched in what little light there was, and those furthest away could have been anything or nothing. He had to be careful. He'd come in here to be safe, not to do himself some harm. He watched his step as best as he could and reached out a hand to steady himself against a tree. Only what he touched didn't feel so much like a tree as something soft and pulpy, less than flesh. He snatched his hand away in disgust and shock, only to find strands of whatever he'd touched come away on his fingers. Dunning didn't think. He just shoved himself away, rubbing his hand against his leg until his fingers ached. When he regained his composure, he realised he'd sent himself deeper into the woods. He could no longer see the heath. He no longer knew which way he was facing. If swearing could have oriented him, he would have been fine. When he'd finished cursing, the noises of the woods were all around. Things snapping, the breeze being broken into something like a voice by the trees, other, less easily identified sounds. Indecision held him immobile. A step in any direction might lead him towards freedom, or a night in the woods. He couldn't have wandered that far into the woods, and if he was sensible, he could easily find his way out. All he had to do was take a dozen steps in each direction, and then back again, and he would find the way out within a couple of minutes. He started forward, measuring his strides carefully. With each one, he felt as though something was backing away from him, an idea that was not in the least reassuring. It felt like forever before he counted his 12th, and beyond that lay only more darkness. He had to resist the urge to take just one more step, then one more, and then keep going. The way out might be right behind him. Carefully, he doubled back on himself, but before he'd taken half his steps, he swore again. There was a tree in his path. He wouldn't let this one startle him into idiocy. At least this one felt the way a tree should feel, but it also meant that he couldn't have been heading back along the same path, and his idea had fallen through. There was no way out. Anger made him lash out, but it was something else that made a barely audible chuckling sound. A sound like something with a mouth full of mud, or worse. Dunning pushed himself off the tree, and he stepped into utter blackness beyond it. His hands held out before him to warn him of any possible collision. A strange hand took his in the darkness, and when he pulled back with a cry, it peeled away in his grasp like an empty glove. "Give me a hand," he thought crazily, and spluttered a laugh as he backed away. There had to be a way out of this, and he would find it, whatever it took. He only wished that the morning wasn't so far away, that it would come quickly to chase away anything he need fear. Trees surrounded him, though some of what he told himself were trees shook and stumbled. He daren't look upon them any less than he dared to stop moving. He pushed himself past more trees, and then past a form that he might have had more chance of recognising if there had been more of it. Whatever he touched now in the darkness, he mustn't let it stop him. However many of them they were still less than he was. The morning would arrive, and as long as he didn't stop moving, it would find him back with his wife and daughter. He could hold on to that, at least. Too late, he feared that they were not converging on him so much as herding him. He raised his head long enough to help himself find an escape and was unable to lower it even when he realised there was none. They were all around, crawling, shambling, limping between the trees, their broken and incomplete forms making an abomination of their ability to move. He only saw them from the corner of his eye, because he was unable to look away from what was waiting for him just ahead. It stood between the trees, white as the moon and worse than naked. Its outstretched arms could only reach the trees because they were too long for its spindly body, its fingers almost half as long as the arms they grew from. It raised a blank, featureless globe that served as a head and began to grin blindly, only it wasn't reminiscent of a natural smile so much as dough tearing. In that moment, a terror that he might never see his family again outweighed any fears for his own safety. Rage made him cry out, but he was echoed by several voices that had infinitely more of that emotion, if much less of a physical means to express it. He was moving, running towards the apparition that was blocking his path. If it could tear itself apart so easily, then by Christ, wait until he got a hold of it. There was little ground between them. He would be upon it in an instant. Its mouth stretched wide, wider than any mouth should, wide enough to swallow his head if he let it. It raised its ridiculously long arms towards him, though whether to warn him off or to embrace him, he couldn't tell. When it came, the thing had even less physical presence than he'd imagined. Dunning felt something settling over him like a wadded curtain of diseased flesh. As he started to tear with his hands, his eyes screwed shut. The feelings that washed over him were brief, but vivid enough almost to make him surrender to his fate. He smelled flesh gone bad and then rotten. He smelled the sea, felt a vast expanse of it weigh down upon him. He felt an ageless agony rack his body and mind, an agony so intense that it seemed intent upon wiping away any human emotion he'd ever had. None of it was enough to stop him clawing at the thing, tearing into it until his hands felt caked in something he dared not imagine. When he opened his eyes, the rage that almost filled his mind allowed him to confront the others. If need be, he would tear and bite at every one of them until he gained his freedom or lost his mind. But rather than moving towards him, they were retreating amongst the trees, fading into the darkness, leaving parts of themselves behind like a trail to follow. The one nearest hid much of itself behind a tree that was too thin to conceal any natural form, though the part that it showed was bad enough. With what passed for its arm, it beckoned him to join them. Dunning looked down at himself, but that no longer helped as much as it should have done. "No," he said, and tried to repeat it, but his voice was even less certain now. "No, I'm not one of you." He turned away from the ruined face that watched him with more sympathy than he would have feared, and though a fire burned his veins and it hurt to move, he began walking. He wanted to run, but he didn't have the power or trust the whole of his body to obey him. However tired he became, though, he would never stop walking, not until he found his family. The night no longer held anything for him to fear. Let the trees shake and the creatures of the night cry out. But the darkness wouldn't last forever. He shut these things out, and whatever else was happening to his physical state. As long as he had legs, he could walk, and it would take even more than the loss of those to keep him from his family now. His one remaining fear was that by the time he got home to them, there would not be enough left of him for them to recognise.